So thank you, everybody. I'm going to refer to some notes on my phone while I speak because I'm very deliberate about what I say and how I say it, especially when it comes to political issues or things that are debatable or things that are very close to our heart or pull at various things. So just bear with me if I look at my phone. I'm not on social media. I'm not on anything else. I'm just referring to some guidelines that I've put down for myself. Um, thanks for coming out today. I know that campus is over, and I know everybody. It's summer, and it's also really nice weather. And I think this weather is not always here for Calgarians. So the fact that you're sitting in this room and not out there, I appreciate it. Like Mohammed said, I'm not from here. I just did my doctorate here. I'm actually based in Toronto, so it's really nice to be here. I wish I could have spent more time at this campus. It's a really nice campus. Yeah, it's really nice to be here. A bit about background about me. So I'm South African, proudly South African. Prior to, I would say, 7th of October, if you said to people I'm from South Africa, people would be like, "Where in South Africa? Where from Africa?" And I think now the whole world knows what South Africa is and what we stand for, and a bit more about the country. So, safe to say we're on the map, if you can put it that way. But we moved to Canada, so my family is over there. My husband, my two daughters, my mom, my son's here as well. He's just gone to the car. We moved to Canada 7 years ago. Prior to that, we were in the Middle East for a couple of years, and then we've been based in South Africa for most of our lives. And I've done, for the past 10 years, like Mohammed said, I've done a lot of work. My background is oil and gas and mining, but for the past 10 years, I kind of pivoted to doing more international development, sustainable development work. I was in consulting for a bit, and I think the thing that I missed was the impact that I wanted to have. And I was seeing that in kind of the professional private sector space, but I really wanted to see that in places where it was needed. And so I kind of pivoted to the international development space professionally. And then personally, I try and do, humanitarian work where I can to supplement that, right? So a lot of my work on Palestine is in my personal capacity, not in my professional capacity, but I draw on a lot of my professional experience to do the work that I do in Palestine and in Gaza specifically. And that's in the form of both humanitarian work, but also advocacy and activism. So I try and do kind of both parts. I also used to work as a consultant in the DEI and human rights space. So there's a lot of advocacy, activism, knowledge that comes from that space that I kind of draw in and use. Like I said, I'm married. I've got 3 kids. We're based in Toronto, and just kind of completed my doctorate here. I'm going to give a few disclaimers before I share. I want to share 2 things today, and I also don't want to speak for all of it because I do want us to have some discussion, and if there's any questions and if there's any debates or there's any disagreements, feel free to kind of share your thoughts because I'd like to think this is a safe space, and I'd like to encourage discussion and debates. I don't want to stand here and speak for all of it. But before I get into that, a few disclaimers. One is I'm not Palestinian. I have been to Palestine, which I'm thankful for. But I'm not standing here speaking on behalf of Palestinians and portraying them in any way or form. I am here to advocate for them in as best as I can in terms of what they want. So, I like to represent my views based on what I feel Palestinians say, want, need, as opposed to me being kind of the decider or decision maker or, forming the opinion on it. I'm going to share my perspectives today, and my perspectives are based on my experience and my knowledge, and also, when we talk about your background, so my skin color, the fact that I'm Muslim, the fact that I come from South Africa, all of that impacts and influences my perspective. So I'm going to share with you my perspective. It might resonate with you, it might not resonate with you. You might agree with it, you might not agree with it, and that's okay. And we can hold that space if there's disagreement or a difference of perspective. I will try my best not to make this about religion because it isn't, but I will reference religion in some instances. But I just want to say that it's, for me, it's not about religion, and I don't want to make this about religion. So that's the disclaimers up front. Two things I want to share with you. So I mean, look, many of us have been involved speaking about Palestine, learning about Palestine, or learning about the conflict between Palestine and Israel since 7th of October. There are also many of us that have been doing this for far longer, or working in this space, advocating for this. And as a South African, our countries are very intertwined, Palestine and South Africa. Palestine played a role in us coming out of apartheid and setting up a democracy. So as South Africans, we grew up understanding the Palestinian struggle, talking about it, feeling it, going to the streets, learning about it, educating ourselves about it. So it's nothing new to us, but we're just seeing a much bigger momentum now. So I want to share with you two things. One is, I want to go through a few learnings that I've gotten in this space. And then two, I want to talk to you about some of the humanitarian work. I just a week ago came back from Cairo, where I was working with a number of displaced families that came out of Gaza. And I just want to share with you some of the sentiment that came out of that trip. So I'm going to cover those two things. The first thing, some learnings. What have I learned in this space, advocating for Palestine, and through my activism? The first is Palestinians are not a monolithic group of people, right? Like any nation, like Canadians, like South Africans, like any nation, we have diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, perspectives, wants, needs. Palestinians are similar, the same. They are not a monolithic group, and therefore they might have different views amongst them. And recently you see it play out, especially those of you that are on social media, and you might see it on social media, the difference in opinion and how that kind of results, and what that means. And how sometimes one group of Palestinians want one thing and another group wants something else. And then there's this uproar about, well, why is this two distinctly different things? For example, one state solution, two state solution. Another one is for resistance, against resistance, right? Again, the thing that I've learned is they're not a monolithic group. They're allowed to have difference of opinions. It's based on their perspectives as well. What I've learned is Palestinians who are diaspora, who are second, third generation of Nakba Palestinians, differ in opinion to those that came from the Nakba, so are older, differ from opinions of Palestinians in West Bank, and differ from Palestinians who are in Gaza, right? Experience is different, views are different, and what they term as solutions and what they need are different, right? If you speak to a lot of the diaspora, a lot of them are out of Palestine. They're living in countries like Canada, a lot of Western societies, and they're fighting the long battle of Palestine. They're fighting for the right of return. They're fighting for their land. They're fighting for freedom, right? When you speak to Palestinians in West Bank, they are living under oppression and settler colonialism every single day. They're watching their homes being taken away. And their fight is really about kind of retaining that and not giving further land away. And when you speak to Gazans, they talk about, we just want to live. We do not want to be bombed and killed today. So, solutions and needs and wants are different, and all of those are validated. And so one of the things I've learned just in the space is to try and hold that space of difference of opinion and perspective, and to try and not fuel it, but kind of advocate for allowing that space of difference and allowing for the different views, and leaning in to ask the questions of, well, why do you feel this way versus why do you feel this way? And let me just understand. And there's no right or wrong, but let me just understand. So that's all it is. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second is around victimhood, resilience, empowerment, and entitlement. One thing I've learned when it comes to Palestinians, and I'm sure many of you see videos on social media. I'm sure many of you watch the raw footage. One of the things we see is the resilience of the Palestinians, the fight for their land, the fight for their freedom. I'm not sure if many of us were in that situation, whether we'd stick to the land, hold fort, and not leave. Many do. Some do leave, but many stay firm and they're resilient and they're fighting for their land and they willing to die over it. And I'm not sure that many other nations or societies would be that way. So one of the things I've learned when working with Palestinians is they don't like the term victim. They don't like to be referred to victims of a genocide. They don't like to be treated as victims, and they don't like victimhood in general, right? They are majority of them are Muslim, and majority of them are very faith-based Muslims. And so as a Muslim, I can tell you, we believe in the afterlife. And so many of them believe that this is a temporary world and we believe in the afterlife. And they believe this is a test from God. So they themselves would use the terms, we are witness to the genocide, right? Some of them, yes, are impacted, injured, killed, etc. But they don't like the word victim or victimhood. They don't like those terms. And when I do a lot of my work in the humanitarian space, I prefer to partner with Palestinian organizations that are run and led by Palestinians for Palestinians, because it's doing for their people and they understand their culture and they understand what is needed. And one of the things I've seen in the work that I've done is this move and this challenge and debate against entitlement and rather empowerment. On a trip now when I was in Cairo, I visited hundreds of displaced families and they have nothing. Nothing. When I say they left with the clothes on their back, they left with the clothes on their back. That's it. Some of them didn't even leave with nappies in their bag for their babies. Like they have nothing. So they are technically entitled to a lot at this stage. And when we went to visit them, number one, it's very hard for them to ask for anything. And number two, when I worked with the Palestinian organizations and we sat in their homes and they talked about cash aid, rental aid, food aid, these organizations would actually challenge them and say, what do you need and what do you really need? Because some of them were living, and I'll give you an example, some of them had chosen to live in apartments of like 25,000 Egyptian pounds per month. Some of them were living in apartments of 3,000 Egyptian pounds per month. And I would go along with this organization and they would challenge the person living in the 25,000 Egyptian pound apartment saying, why do you have to stay here? This is temporary. You don't have the money to stay here. You're asking us to give you the money. But with this money, I could house 8 families in apartments, different apartments, but I could pay for 8 of these families in cheaper apartments. And there's this pushback against becoming entitled. Palestinians push back against their own people about becoming entitled and feeding into charity cases, and rather moving to a space of live within your means and then rebuild, kind of settle and start redoing for yourself. Learn to rebuild, learn to become independent, learn to do for yourself. Do not fall prey into the charity sector and becoming entitled and needy and living off that. Part of that's also to do with Islam, but it's just been really interesting to watch, because when you watch the whole charity sector and what they do, and when you look at Palestinians and how they speak and what they want, it's a very different culture and what they're trying to espouse. So that's just been a learning that I've seen as well, working in this space. Um, the third thing I want to talk about is kind of this faith and belief in the year after. So just coming back to a point that I made earlier, majority of Palestinians are Muslim, not all, and I'll come to that point about religion just now. But majority of Palestinians are Muslim, and if you've watched the videos, if you've seen the raw footage, you'll kind of see them say Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil, or when someone passes away, you'll see them say Alhamdulillah, and they raise their finger, and Allahu Akbar, and they point to Allah, and that's because it's this belief of this world is temporary. It is a test. It is short-lived. As long as it feels, it is short-lived. Because as Muslims, we do believe in the year after, and we do believe this is a test about what happens to us in the year after. And when you see Palestinians and their resistance, and they say Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil, or Allahu Akbar, or Alhamdulillah, it's because they know that the person that they've lost has been martyred and is going straight to Jannah, to heaven. And that's a privilege. For us as a Muslim, that is a privilege, because that is ultimately what any of us truly want in our religion. It's to land up in heaven, in Jannah, right? So for them, as grief-stricken as they are, they see it as a privilege. I am chosen by Allah. I'm one of the chosen ones. My child has been chosen, my husband, my wife, my family member has been chosen, and they've been selected to go to Jannah. And inshallah, for the grief that I will go through and what I've witnessed, I will meet them there one day. That's the belief. And so I'm taking the time to explain this, because I don't know that, I mean, I hope people understand this, but you see this a lot in the videos, you see this being talked about, but not everybody takes the time to explain why is it that way. Why do we say Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil? Why do we say Alhamdulillah when someone dies? Why do we feel, why does it, sometimes you can't resonate with the grief and the loss that you're seeing them go through, and then you kind of feels like disconnect, like I wouldn't react that way, right? Again, we see it as being weak, and we see them as being strong because of their belief, their tawakkul, which is the belief in God, and the belief and the trust that what will be, and what has been decided has been decided. So you'll see a lot of this, coming from the Palestinians, around kind of belief in the year after. I also want to just mention around faith, is that Palestine is not a Muslim or Islamic issue, right? Majority of people who live in Palestine happen to be Muslim, but they are Christians and they are Jews, right? And they live in harmony, and they live respectfully, and there's multi-religions in Palestine. Islam happens to be the dominant religion because majority Muslims happen to be, well, Palestinians happen to be majority Muslims, but it's not that it's an Islamic issue, and it's not a Muslim issue, and it's not a religious issue. I attended a talk earlier this year, I think, and there was a Palestinian, Fifi, who was speaking at the talk, and she's Christian, and she spoke about living in Gaza. She spoke about all her family in Gaza, and she sat and she cried, because she said, Palestinian Christians are not the majority, but we are not being recognized as even being Palestinian, because everyone is making this about Islam. And so we don't even get the recognition and acknowledgement that we even exist, Palestinian Christians. And we're being killed off at the masses, and will almost be extinct as a nation, Palestinian Christians in Palestine. Their churches were all destroyed. They were being eradicated and killed off in mass numbers. The bombing, the shooting, the airstrikes were not discriminatory against any religion. They were taking place, or they are taking place, across the board. So it wasn't one religion that was being persecuted. It is Palestinians as a nation. And I've listened to a few Christian Palestinians talk about um, Christianity in Palestine and how it's upheld and how it's respected and how it's not even being talked about and just being dismissed and kind of forgotten. So I think we also have to remember that this is not when we fight for the freedom of Palestine, this is not fighting for a religious cause. This is fighting for human rights. It could be any nation. This is fighting for a nation and their ability to live peacefully, with human rights and in dignity. Whether they are Muslim, whether they are Christian, whether they are Jewish, it doesn't matter. They're all Palestinian. They live there. So the fourth thing that I want to mention around just learnings is the short-term and the long-term fight. That's another lesson or learning that I've gotten, especially in my recent trip. And I mentioned this earlier, that when you speak to Palestinians and when you ask them about what they want, some of them have very different answers. And that's sometimes down to their own experience, sometimes down to their own perspective, and what their immediate need is. A lot of the diaspora are fighting for the long-term solution, and they're fighting for an end state to kind of, whether it's one state, two state, right of return. That's kind of what they're fighting towards. But when you speak to Palestinians that are in Gaza, a lot of them speak about the short term, the fact that they just want a ceasefire so that they can go back into Gaza and they can rebuild a house that was broken down or bombed to pieces, and that their children are not at risk. That's what they speak about. And it's not that they don't want the long term, and it's not that the long term doesn't want the short term. It's just that all of these things exist. And so part of it is understanding, what are those needs and how do we fight for both of those needs? How do we achieve a ceasefire so that no more people can die while talking and thinking about the long-term solution? And that we can't only have a ceasefire until we solve for this. Because by then, I'm not sure how many Palestinians are actually left if we're going to try and figure out all of this first. So it's just to say that there's different perspectives around when you ask a Palestinian, what do you want? What do you need right now? You might get varied answers, and it is a reflection of their own perspective and experience and what their own family or themselves are going through at this moment, and it's valid. The fifth thing I want to talk about is around centering Palestinian voices. So, I mean, I'm happy to stand here and talk to you, but one of the things I said to you was, I'm not a Palestinian and I don't represent Palestinians. I don't want to speak on their behalf. One of the things Mohammed and I talked about when we set up this discussion is, should we have a Palestinian here, standing here and actually talking about them representing their own nation and their needs and their wants? And I advocate for that. I completely advocate for that. And it's not to say that people like myself or any of you that are not Palestinian can't speak for Palestine. We should, like everybody should. But I will always advocate for centering Palestinian voices wherever and whenever it is possible. Right? And one is not just because they need to speak and represent themselves, but they need to be given the platform. And for all of you, if you have these engagements or if you set up events or anything, when my advice to you is try and center Palestinian voices as much as you possibly can. It's important to not just hear from them, but it's important to allow them to speak. Sometimes they need to vent, sometimes they need to express themselves, and it's important to give them that space and a safe space to do that in. And the last thing I want to say just around the learnings is kind of the question of, people ask me this, why do you fight for Palestine? You're not Palestinian. You don't even live in Palestine. It really has nothing to do with you. You live in Canada and you've kind of left South Africa. You've chosen to live in Canada. Why don't you just live in your country and live peacefully with all the wonderful things that Canada gives you? Why fight for Palestine? And for me, the fight for Palestine is, it's not just about Palestine. I don't know if any of you have heard of this saying, which is, we are not free until Palestine is free, and Palestine is not free until we are free. Right? I see some of you nodding. Palestine, the issue, the conflict with Palestine that has been going on for 75 years is probably one of the most or highly political, debatable conflicts that have been taking place and still exist. And while many of us might not be Palestinian, the fight for Palestine represents a number of things in this world. It's about colonialism, it's about settler colonialism, it's about justice, it's about freedom, it's about human rights. And a lot of what is happening in Palestine is because of colonialism, right? In our country, Canada, we have our own history of colonialism and indigenous groups and residential schools and what's taken place here. You know, we have our own history on colonialism. In South Africa, we've got a very strong history on colonialism and what that did to our country. Pretty much most of Africa does. Australia does. You know, there's a lot of countries that have repercussions of colonialism. And Palestine happens to be a very it's a situation that involves many superpowers in this world and draws on colonialism and the saying of, you know, Palestine will not be free until we are free, and will not be free until Palestine is free, comes from, if we cannot decolonize ourselves from what colonialism society or has instilled in us, and all of us in this room have been colonized, every single one of us. If we cannot decolonize ourselves, we cannot fight for Palestine, for the rights of Palestinians in the way that needs to be fought. I mean, many of us, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of you, but I'll speak about my community back in Toronto and also in South Africa. We have a lot of activists, but we have a lot of activists that color in the lines, because society draws your boundaries and your lines, and people are scared to step foot outside of that line and to rock the boat because they might get fired, something might happen. But where did those lines and those boundaries come from? Colonialism, right? We're living in a society that has rules that are not equal and fair to everybody. And so we all operating within boundary lines that don't allow us to be totally free and equal. And that's kind of where the saying comes from. And that's why the fight for Palestine has become a fight for everybody, because it's about decolonization, and it is about, you know, the history in this world and where we are. So that's kind of the learnings I just wanted to share from you in terms of the activism side and the advocacy and what I've learned in that space. I do want to share with you some experiences from the humanitarian work that I've done, especially kind of spending some time in Cairo with displaced families from Gaza, and just share with you some of the sentiment. I learned a lot being on the ground for a week ago, just listening to families and understanding how decisions are made, what's the reality of the situation now that you displaced in Cairo. So the first thing is kind of, why do people leave, right? Why do Gazans leave Gaza? Majority of Gazans don't want to leave. Majority of them have not left, and they don't want to leave. But many of them who have families, who have children, fear, you know, death, or, you know, at the end of the day, we're human beings, and they take the necessary actions that they do to try and provide safety. So some of them have left because of what I would call family responsibility, or fear of family responsibility, or safety for their family. Others have left for other reasons. There's a lot of medical evacuations that have taken place. People have been injured. They've had to leave to get treatment, because we all know the state of the hospitals in Gaza at the moment. And some have left from a temporary basis, or even just, you know, mental health, for whatever reasons. Some of them that I met had scholarships lined up for studies, and so they were leaving to pursue some of their studies. And even that, there was, you know, it's a very hard decision for them to leave and decide whether to kind of pursue that, even though they had the right to pursue that, and they got a kind of a full scholarship. So those are some of the reasons of why people leave. There's different ways people can leave. There's 5 ways a Palestinian in Gaza can leave Gaza at the moment. And the first is you have a secondary citizenship or a residence from another country, like a Canadian Palestinian. So Canada plays a role in getting you out, or any of those countries, and it's a non-paid route. So the government of Canada will get you out, will process your paperwork, and will kind of bring you to Canada. That's one of the routes. The second route is a medical evacuation. So there's a agreement between Ministry of Health in Palestine and Ministry of Health in Egypt, or any of the other countries, and you can kind of leave. And again, it's a non-paid route, so you can get out of it from a medical evacuation perspective. The third is the student scholarship route. You have a scholarship somewhere, and so you can leave. And again, it's a non-paid route. The fourth is you have papers for Egypt. So you've got a residence, or you've got family that's got residence that can sponsor you. So you have a right to stay in Egypt, and that's a non-paid route. And then there's the paid route, which is with Yahalla. It's a cartel. It's it's ranged between $2,000 to $7,000 per person, US dollars, to leave. And that's kind of the informal route. So a lot of people have raised money. You'll see a lot of GoFundMe's. People have raised money and they've kind of exited. That's kind of how people leave. I met people from all of those spectrums, in terms of being in Cairo, so what you would consider displaced. The first four all have a right to return because they had a right to leave. The families that have paid to leave, we are yet to find out what their right of return is, other than they might have to pay to get back in by an informal route. So that's another consideration. You pay to get out, but then you might pay to get back in. And that's still kind of to be seen. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to mention is, so what does it mean if you've left via the different routes when you're in Cairo? How you've left determines what access you have as a displaced individual. So if you've left Cairo as the first group, which is sponsored by another country, they will typically support you to get your paperwork, have a couple of nights stay in Cairo, and then they'll fly you out to that country. Some of them don't fly you out, some of them do fly you out. So you have some support. If you're in the second group where you are medical evacuee, the government of Egypt actually sponsors you. They put you up in a hospital, they evacuate your whole family, they put the family up in the hospital, they give you care, they give you post care, and they even put you up in an apartment afterwards. And that's done by the government of Egypt for these displaced medical evacuees. The third route, which is the student sponsorship, if you've been sponsored and you've taken up the sponsorship, let's say to go to Belgium or Hungary or one of these countries that are sponsoring students, that will be paid for and you will carry on. Most of the people, if not all that I met that evacuated that way, their sponsorship came and went. So their sponsorship was for September last year. They didn't take advantage of it because 7th of October started happening, or for October last year. And they're now using the sponsorship as a way to exit, but their scholarship has fallen away. So they have the paper that allows them to walk across the Rafah border, but they don't have a university to go to that where the fees are paid for and covered. So they are stuck in Cairo. So they've got no access to services in Cairo. They've got access to no money, no government services, no medical care, no education, nothing. You are a refugee kind of in Cairo. The fourth one, was that the fourth one? I'm losing track. The route of kind of paying to get out. If you've paid to get out, again, you've got no access to services. You've got, there's no governmental support or services that you can access because you are illegally living in Cairo, and you're not documented. Oh, and the other group was you have Egyptian documentation. If you've got Egyptian documentation, you have access to services like any other resident in Egypt would be. So kids can go to school. Some healthcare is available. Some healthcare is private and not available. Some university students have to pay. So right now there's I think about 100,000 displaced individuals, families in Cairo. Majority of them do not have access to any services. Their kids are not in school. Those that were doing university are not going to university. There's no healthcare for them. They don't have housing support, and they kind of rely on organizations, individuals to come together to provide the necessary support or fundraise, right? So that's the situation kind of in Cairo at the moment. And that's the situation to kind of access to post or kind of post-exit services. This is why you have so many charity organizations working in Cairo. This is why you have Palestinians working in Cairo and trying to fundraise. This is why a lot of funds are needed right now for these displaced individuals or families, because there isn't that kind of access or support. The fifth thing that I want to cover is kind of fourth thing is future plans. So every single family that I met with in Cairo, I asked them, what do you plan to do? You know, are you staying here? Are you planning to go anywhere? 100% of them said they're all going back to Gaza. Every single one of them. And the answer was, immediately a ceasefire is called, we are going back to Gaza. And when you ask them, go back to what? Your house has been bombed, you don't have a business, you go back to what? And they said, we'll figure it out. We will take the rubble from our own home and rebuild our own house. We don't need you or anybody else to rebuild. We will rebuild our own home, but we are going back. That is our land, that is our home, that is our country, and we're going back. 100% of the families said that we visited. So, it's just, and so when you ask them, when you have that conversation with them around, well, then why did you leave? It's just out of fear. It's out of fear of dying. It's out of fear of one of their family members dying. It's out of fear of being injured. Many of them don't fear death. Many of them fear injury, right? Can I grab that water? Many of them don't fear death because, like I say, as a Muslim or a very faith-based Muslim, we know that our death date is set for us. We know that when God is going to call us back, we're going to go back. But many of them fear injuries. I visited 2 hospitals while I was in Cairo, and I can't tell you how many amputees I saw. Limbs are gone. Children. This is majority children. Limbs are gone. Eyes are out of the socket. Half of the head is blown off. Because it's about quality of life then. So a lot of them leave because their children might get injuries. And then the quality of life is different, right? You are forever living with a disability, a mental disability, physical disability, trauma, PTSD, whatever it is. So most of them said, the reason we leave is to spare us from the trauma and the PTSD and the injuries, not from death, to spare us from that, but we're going to go back because that's our land and that's what we want and that's where we belong. And we don't belong anywhere else. And when we talked about Cairo, again, 100% of the families said, it is harder being here. And a lot of them said, I regret leaving. I would rather be back in Gaza because it's easier. Despite the bombings, we're with our people. We're with people that are in a similar situation. We are all in the same thing. Now we're living in a country where majority of people don't, it feels like it's just normal everyday life. Everybody's going about their lives as normal. They see the rest of the world living as normal, and they just cannot live. The PTSD and the trauma is so real and so debilitating. They can't find joy in just being outside, going for a walk, taking their kids somewhere, buying something. There's no joy in any of that. They do it, but there's no joy in any of that. They don't feel the want, the desire to do any of those things. And so, again, for me, it was just really eye-opening to hear that from families who had been in a genocide for 7-8 months, who had gotten an opportunity to leave And the first thing they say is, I'm going back. I'm going back. That's my home. I'm going back. I don't care if I don't have, I don't care if it's rubble. I will go and rebuild. So it was really eye opening. And I'm sharing that because I think, a lot of us um, outside of Palestine say, well, why don't you just open the borders? And why don't you just leave? And let's just help everybody fundraise and then exit. Most of them don't want to. Most of them don't want to. And then the reasons they do um, are not for the reasons we think they do. And when you ask them if they want to go back, the answer is yes. So it's just really important to just understand where they are despite what they've gone through. Okay. So the last thing that I want to mention is kind of how do we help, right? How do we help? What can we do? A number of things. One is, again, I'm going to separate this into advocacy and humanitarian work, because the advocacy helps get a ceasefire, and it helps the long-term solution, and it helps advocate for the Palestinians. And the humanitarian work is solving for what they're currently going through at the moment. So on the advocacy side, we have to use our voices, right? I'm going to say something, and please don't take offense to this, but I'm glad that there are a lot of white people in the room, to put it bluntly, right? Sorry, I don't mean to call people out, but I'm glad that there are white people in this room. We need more people that don't look like me speaking up for Palestine, right? And that's the truth, because there's always been people like me speaking up for Palestine, but we don't get taken seriously, and the message doesn't land, and it doesn't convert the people that need to be converted. It's obvious, she's a hijabi Muslim woman speaking for other hijabi Muslim women. Like, yeah, sure. But we need people that are different. We need people that have previously been privileged in society to speak up for the underprivileged right now. So one is, you've got to use your voice. You've got to use your platforms. That's the minimum that we can do for Palestine right now, is use our voice, use our platform, and take some risk. I can tell you, as I lived for about 10 years in apartheid in South Africa, so I didn't really feel it. But there are some stories from my school that I can now think back and was like, oh yeah, that was apartheid. But I can tell you from our history of apartheid and becoming a democratic country, people had to die over it, right? People died over fighting for freedom. People lost their jobs. People got arrested. There were lots of repercussions and long-term repercussions. Freedom comes at a price. So if we are not willing to take risks for this fight, it's not going to be achieved. Like, their freedom is not going to be achieved. And it's us that have got to take the risks. It's the people who have the ability to lose something that need to be fighting this fight, because the Palestinians have lost way too much. So it's, one is, use your voice, use your platform, speak up, take risks. The second is around, putting pressure on government. Here in Canada, in other countries, the political arena plays a very big role in decisions, support, funding, all of these things. And so we need to pressurize our governments to represent us as their constituency as to what we want. And we've seen a lot of this in Canada, and it's good in terms of, on both sides. There's a lot of it in terms of flare-ups, but we need to play a part in that as well, in the political side. A lot of people will tell you, oh, I don't really speak about Palestine because I don't get political. You have to get political. You're a citizen of this country. You kind of have to get political, unfortunately. You should vote, and you should have a view, and you should speak up, and you should get political. We all should. And that doesn't mean you go and burn shit, but I mean, you can get political in a decent way without hurting anybody. So on the advocacy side, always speak about Palestine. Use your platform, use your space. I'm going to say this again, use your whiteness, and please don't take offense to that, and use your privilege to speak up for Palestine, um, and put pressure on governments, because we need to shape and change how things are being done globally, and it needs to represent what we need or what we want. On the humanitarian side, there's a lot of good organizations doing good work. There's a lot of support needed in terms of money for displaced families, support services in Gaza and out of Gaza. In Gaza right now, we're doing a lot of work building tents, because a lot of tents in Rafah have been bombed and there's no housing anymore for a lot of families. So there's a lot of work that's needed in Gaza and out of Gaza. I would say my advice to you is do your due diligence when you support organizations. Understand where the money is going and understand how it's supporting the people of Palestine. There are a lot of organizations doing good work, but there are also a lot of organizations that aren't doing things in the best and most ethical manner for the people of Palestine. Do your due diligence. But in the humanitarian space, there's a lot of work that's needed, a lot of work. And, for all of us, wherever we can support, wherever we can give, it doesn't mean you have to do or come up with it yourself, because it's a lot of work and you need to know how to do it and what connections to have. You can support, you can give, but do your due diligence and give where you can. Again, Islamically, I will add, charity is one of the pillars of our religion. It's one of our 5 pillars, and we believe, when we give a little, God gives us a whole lot in return, and we see that in our lives. So, I just want to encourage, where you can give, give. There's no amount too small. There's no skill set too small. There are a lot of Palestinians who have left that can work remote jobs in IT. Help them find jobs. That's another way of helping. There's very many different ways that you can help. Just try and help in the humanitarian space. And if you don't know how, I'm happy for you to contact me, and I can talk to you about different options and routes that might work for you. Because there's very many different ways. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think I've spoken for way too long, but if there's any questions, if there's any difference of opinion or perspectives, I'm happy to hear as well.